The thermometer outside Jacob Brenner's cabin read 28 degrees below zero and falling. Inside the underground chamber beneath Matthias Keller's cabin floor, the temperature held steady at 52 degrees, just as the boy had promised it would. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable than this one. The fire had burned all night, but it wasn't enough. Matthias Keller woke on the morning of February 9, 1882, to a silence that felt wrong. The cabin was cold, far colder than it should have been, with the fireplace still glowing. He was 14 years old, and in the next few minutes he would learn that some kinds of cold cannot be survived simply by being strong or prepared or careful. He called for his father. No answer came from the sleeping platform against the far wall. Matthias climbed down from his own bed near the fireplace, his breath visible in the air despite the embers still radiating heat. The cabin was small, barely 16 feet square, built in the traditional method his father Friedrich had learned in the old country. Notched logs at the corners, mud and moss, chinked between gaps, a single door, one small window. It had kept them alive through 2 Montana winters. Friedrich had assured him it was solid construction, adequate for the frontier. The thermometer mounted beside the door read 8 degrees inside the cabin. Matthias reached his father's sleeping platform and knew immediately. Friedrich Keller lay on his side beneath 2 wool blankets and a bearskin, his face peaceful, his body rigid with cold. Matthias touched his father's shoulder. The flesh was hard, unyielding. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He stood there for a long time, unable to process what he was seeing. The fire had burned. He had checked it twice during the night, adding wood both times. The fireplace had done its job. But the cold had come through the walls anyway, seeping through gaps in the chinking, radiating through the logs themselves, pulling heat from the cabin faster than the fire could replace it. His father had frozen to death 20 feet from an active fire. Matthias walked to the fireplace and sat on the floor, staring at the embers. His mind felt slow, struggling to understand the mechanics of what had happened. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 37 degrees below zero during the night. The wind had been calm, so it wasn't wind chill. It was simply cold, pure, and absolute. The kind of cold that turned the Montana wilderness into something actively hostile to human life. The cabin's construction, adequate for normal winter nights, had been no match for extreme cold. The notched corners allowed air infiltration. The mud chinking had dried and cracked over 2 seasons. The gaps were small, nearly invisible, but they were everywhere. The logs themselves, dried and seasoned, conducted cold from outside to inside. The single stone fireplace could heat the air near it, but the cabin bled warmth faster than the fire could produce it. Friedrich had gone to sleep in a shelter that appeared sound, but was fundamentally inadequate for the environment. By morning, that inadequacy had killed him. Matthias would spend the next hour sitting by the fireplace, unable to move or cry or act. Then he would walk 2 miles through brutal cold to the nearest neighbor. By afternoon, men would come to help with the burial, though the ground was frozen too hard to dig. They would store Friedrich's body in a snowbank until spring thaw allowed proper burial. But in those first 60 minutes, alone with his father's frozen body, something changed in Matthias Keller's mind. A question formed that would obsess him for the next 2 years. A question that would make neighbors think he was losing his sanity. A question that would eventually save 13 lives. How? Do you stay warm when the cabin freezes? Spring came late to Montana Territory in 1882. The ground didn't thaw enough for burial until mid-April. Matthias spent those weeks living with Wilhelm Schaffer, a German immigrant who had known Friedrich in the old country. Wilhelm was kind, quiet, and practical. He didn't press the boy to talk about what had happened, but Matthias talked anyway. He asked the same question to everyone who would listen. How do you stay warm when the cabin freezes? Wilhelm's answer was typical. You burn more wood. You keep the fire going strong. My father's fire was burning, Matthias said. It wasn't enough. Wilhelm nodded slowly. Sometimes the cold is too strong. That's the risk of living here. We accept it. Matthias asked Jacob Brenner, whose cabin was a mile north. Jacob was a large man with a loud voice and strong opinions about how frontier life should be lived. His answer was blunt. Your father was unlucky. It was a bad night. Most nights aren't that cold. You survive the winters that can be survived and accept that some winters kill people. That's reality. But there must be a way, Matthias insisted. Something that works even when fires can't keep up. Jacob laughed. You want magic, boy? There's no magic. Cold is cold. You either tough it out or you die. Your father was a good man, but he was also older, not as strong as he once was. You're young. You'll survive winters he couldn't. Matthias asked Greta Brenner, Jakob's wife, who was more sympathetic. She had known Friedrich and grieved his death genuinely, but her answer was no more helpful. We layer blankets, she said. We sleep close together for warmth. We keep the fire built up through the night. Beyond that, we pray and hope the worst cold doesn't last long. He asked Otto Zimmer, who trapped furs along the creek. Otto had survived 9 Montana winters and considered himself an expert on frontier survival. The secret is a good fireplace, Otto told him. Build it right, use the right stones, make sure the chimney draws properly. That's what keeps you alive. My father's fireplace was well built, Matthias said. It still wasn't enough, Otto shrugged. Then the cabin was poorly chinked. You need to seal every gap. That's basic construction. The chinking was good when we built it. It dried and cracked over time. Then you maintain it. You check it every fall and repair any cracks. That's your responsibility as a cabin owner. Matthias realized Otto was blaming his father for dying, suggesting Friedrich had been careless or lazy. The implication made him angry, but he stayed quiet. He asked 11 different people that spring. Trappers, settlers, the trading post owner, even a traveling preacher who claimed to know about survival in harsh climates. Every answer was some variation of the same useless advice. Burn more wood, seal the gaps, layer blankets, tough it out, accept the risk. No one had a real solution. No one had even thought seriously about the problem. They accepted that extreme cold could kill people in their cabins, and they considered that acceptance a sign of frontier toughness rather than a failure of engineering. Matthias buried his father in May. He stood by the grave on a hillside overlooking the settlement and made a private promise. He would find an answer to the question no one else seemed interested in asking. Matthias returned to his father's cabin in June. Wilhelm had offered to let him stay indefinitely, but the boy needed to be alone. He needed space to think and remember and figure out what came next. The cabin felt empty in ways that had nothing to do with physical occupancy. Friedrich's possessions remained exactly where he had left them. His coat hung on a peg by the door. His sleeping platform where he had died was stripped bare, the blankets washed and folded, but Matthias couldn't bring himself to sleep there. He slept near the fireplace instead, on the floor, wrapped in blankets. During the days, he worked through his father's belongings methodically. There wasn't much. Friedrich had come west with little and accumulated less, but Friedrich had kept a small trunk beneath his sleeping platform, and Matthias had never examined its contents carefully. Inside the trunk, he found his father's past. Letters from family in Germany written in script Matthias could barely read. A Bible with annotations in the margins. And beneath everything, wrapped in oilcloth, a bundle of papers covered in his father's handwriting. Matthias spread the papers on the table and studied them by lamplight. They were sketches and notes, drawn over several years based on the varying ink colors and handwriting consistency. Friedrich had been planning to build improvements to the cabin but had never found time or resources. The sketches showed various designs for better fireplaces, improved window shutters, reinforced door frames, and at the bottom of the stack, 3 pages, devoted to something called a root cellar. The drawings were detailed. They showed a chamber dug beneath the cabin floor lined with stone or brick, accessed by a trapdoor and ladder. Friedrich had written notes in German alongside the sketches. Matthias's command of his father's native language was limited, but he could make out key phrases. Earth holds temperature steady. Below frost line, warmth in winter. Old country method, cellar, for food storage. One note was in English, written more recently based on the ink. Remember grandfather's cellar in Bavaria? Always cool in summer, never froze in winter. Earth insulates both directions. Matthias studied the sketches for hours. His father had drawn cross-sections showing depth measurements, 6 to 8 feet below the surface, width and length dimensions, ventilation considerations. The notes emphasized that underground spaces maintained constant temperature regardless of surface conditions. This was knowledge from the old country, from a place where people had been building structures for centuries and had learned what worked. Friedrich had brought this knowledge to Montana, but had died before applying it. Matthias set the papers down and walked outside. The summer evening was warm, almost 70 degrees. He knelt and dug his hand into the soil beside the cabin. The surface was sun-warmed. He dug deeper. 6 inches down, the earth was noticeably cooler. A foot down, it was cold to the touch despite the warm air above. Earth held temperature. It resisted change. While air could swing from 70 degrees in summer to 40 below in winter, Earth deep enough maintained consistency. The principle was simple. The application was obvious. But would it work in reverse? If Earth stayed cool in summer, would it stay warm in winter? Matthias went back inside and reread his father's notes. One phrase stood out: never froze in winter. Matthias spent July learning to listen to the ground. He started with his father's thermometer, the same instrument that had read 8 degrees inside the cabin the morning Friedrich died. It was a simple mercury thermometer in a wooden case, accurate enough for practical purposes. He dug test holes at various locations around the bed. The first hole went down 2 feet. He lowered the thermometer into it, waited 10 minutes for the reading to stabilize, then recorded the temperature, 61 degrees. The air temperature that afternoon was 78 degrees. He dug the second hole 4 feet deep. The excavation took most of an afternoon. The first 2 feet were soil, mixed with roots and rocks. The next 2 feet were denser clay. He lowered the thermometer. After 10 minutes, 57 degrees. The third hole went 6 feet down. Digging it required 2 full days. Matthias worked in the mornings when the air was coolest, rested during midday heat, resumed in the evenings. At 6 feet, he encountered a layer of packed clay so dense it was almost like soft stone, the thermometer reading 54 degrees. He left the thermometer in the 6-foot hole overnight. The next morning, with the air temperature at 59 degrees, the reading from the hole was still 54 degrees. He checked it again at midday when the air reached 82 degrees. The hole, 54 degrees. Evening, air cooling to 65 degrees. The hole, 54 degrees. The earth below 6 feet maintained constant temperature regardless of what happened at the surface. Matthias expanded his testing. He dug holes at 8 feet deep, which took 4 days of exhausting work. The temperature there, 53 degrees. He realized that going deeper didn't significantly improve the consistency. The critical threshold was around 6 feet. Below that depth, earth temperature stabilized. He tested different locations: near the creek, where soil was wetter; on the hillside, where drainage was better; in the clearing, where sun exposure was maximum. Every location below 6 feet showed the same result: 53 to 55 degrees, unchanging. During a particularly hot week in August, air temperatures reached 94 degrees. Matthias checked his test holes. Still 54 degrees at 6 feet down. He began calculating. If Earth below 6 feet maintained 54 degrees in summer, it would maintain approximately the same temperature in winter. While the air above might drop to 30 or 40 below zero, the Earth at depth would stay at 54. That was cold by human comfort standards, but it was survivable. It was 60 or 70 degrees warmer than the air during extreme cold snaps. A person could survive indefinitely at 54 degrees with adequate clothing and bedding. More importantly, a small enclosed space occupied by a human body would warm above 54. Body heat in a confined area could raise the temperature 10 or 15 degrees. An underground chamber at 6 feet deep, small enough that body heat mattered, could maintain 65 to 70 degrees while the surface world froze. The principle was sound. The physics were simple. The solution was obvious. Matthias needed to build an underground chamber beneath his cabin floor, not a root cellar for storing vegetables, a sleeping chamber for surviving extreme cold when surface shelter failed. Matthias spent the last 2 weeks of August calculating dimensions and materials. His father's sketches provided a starting point, but adapting them for a sleeping chamber required modifications. The chamber needed to be large enough for a person to lie down comfortably, but small enough that body heat would raise the temperature. He settled on dimensions: 6 feet wide, 10 feet long, 8 feet deep. The walls needed to be solid. Bare earth would crumble over time, especially if moisture seeped in. His father's sketches showed stone lining, but Matthias had seen brick construction at the trading post. Bricks were uniform, stackable, and created walls that were both strong and smooth. He calculated the surface area of the walls and ceiling. Accounting for the arched ceiling design his father had sketched, he needed approximately 400 bricks. In early September, Matthias rode to the trading post, a full day's journey east. Gustav Hoffmann ran the establishment, a sturdy building that served as supply depot and connection to distant civilization. When Matthias asked about bricks, Gustav walked him to a stack behind the main building. "Bricks come from St. Louis," Gustav explained, "transported by steamboat up the Missouri, then by wagon. Each brick costs money to move. I charge 8 cents per brick." Matthias did the mathematics in his head. 400 bricks at 8 cents each was $32. He had $38 total, the money from selling his father's furs the previous spring, plus a small amount Friedrich had saved. $32 for bricks would leave him $6 for everything. Else he needed nails, hinges, oil for lamps, food for winter. "That's a lot of bricks," Gustav said. "What are you building?" "A cellar," Matthias answered. "Root cellar, you don't need bricks for that. Dig a hole, shore up the walls with wood, cover it. Vegetables don't care about fancy construction. I want it done properly." Gustav studied the boy. "Stone is free. The creek is full of flat stones. Use those." Matthias had considered stone, but stone was irregular, required careful selection and fitting, and took far longer to work with than uniform bricks. "I need bricks," Matthias said. Gustav shrugged. "Your money. But I can't deliver 400 bricks. You'll need to haul them yourself. You want bricks? You transport them." "How many can I carry per trip?" Gustav walked to Matthias's wagon, a small cart pulled by a single horse Friedrich had owned. "In that? Maybe 18 bricks per load if you don't want to break your axle." Matthias calculated. 400 bricks divided by 18 bricks per trip meant 23 trips. Each round trip took 2 days, 46 days of hauling. "I'll start next week," Matthias said. Gustav counted out the first 18 bricks and loaded them into the wagon. "People are going to think you're crazy, boy, spending all your money and all your time on bricks. Let them think what they want." The first trip home took longer than expected. The wagon's axle wasn't designed for concentrated weight. Matthias had to stop frequently to rest the horse. By the time he reached his cabin, evening was falling. He unloaded the bricks carefully, stacking them beside the cabin wall. 18 bricks, 382 to go. Matthias broke ground on August 20th, 1883. He started inside the cabin, near the center of the floor, where structural support was strongest. The location was carefully chosen, too close to the walls, and the excavation might undermine the cabin's foundation, too close to the fireplace, and he risked collapsing the stonework. He pulled up the floorboards in a 6-foot by 10-foot rectangle. The boards were thick pine, well fitted. Removing them felt destructive, like dismantling his father's work. But the floor could be replaced. His father couldn't. Beneath the boards was packed earth, the original ground the cabin had been built upon. Matthias took his shovel and drove it into the soil. The first shovelful came up easily, loose topsoil mixed with organic matter. He dumped it into a bucket and started filling. Jakob Brenner arrived mid-morning. Matthias heard his horse before he saw the man. Jakob rode up to the cabin and dismounted without being invited. "Heard you're tearing up your floor," Jakob said, standing in the doorway. "Digging a cellar," Matthias replied, not stopping his work. "Root cellar inside the cabin? That's the stupidest thing I've heard. You build root cellars outside. Everyone knows that." "This isn't for roots." Jakob stepped inside, looked at the excavation, and laughed. "What is it for, then?" "Sleeping." The laughter stopped. Jakob stared at the boy. "You're digging a hole to sleep in?" "Yes." "Why in God's name would you sleep in a hole?" "Because it stays warm underground. The earth below 6 feet maintains steady temperature, 54 degrees year-round." Jacob's expression shifted from confusion to pity. "Boy, you've lost your mind. Your father's death did something to you. This isn't normal." "My father died because the cabin got too cold. Underground doesn't get cold." "So you're going to live in a hole like an animal? That's your solution?" Matthias kept digging. "I'm going to have a place to go when extreme cold comes, somewhere that doesn't depend on fire or luck." Jakob shook his head. "You're wasting your time and your father's money. This is crazy. People are going to talk. Let them talk. I'm trying to help you. You're young, you don't understand how foolish this looks. Real men don't hide in holes. They face the cold and deal with it. Real men also die from the cold. My father did." Jacob's face darkened. "Your father was a good man, but he was old and his cabin wasn't properly maintained. That's not the same as what you're doing. You're building fear into your life. You're letting one bad winter turn you into a coward." Matthias stopped digging and looked directly at Jakob. "If protecting myself from freezing to death makes me a coward, then I'm a coward." Jakob mounted his horse. "People are going to laugh at you, boy. Mark my words." He rode off. Matthias returned to digging. By evening he had excavated 2 feet down across the entire 6x10 rectangle. 8 cubic feet of earth removed, bucket by bucket, dumped outside. His hands were blistered despite gloves. His back ached. The work had barely begun. The first 3 feet of excavation took a week. The soil was workable, a mixture of sandy loam and clay that came up readily with shovel and bucket. Matthias established a rhythm. Dig, fill the bucket, carry it up the ladder he had positioned in the hole, dump it outside, return, repeat. Each bucket held approximately half a cubic foot of earth. Each foot of depth across the 60-square-foot area required removing 60 cubic feet total. That meant 120 buckets per foot of depth. 3 feet down meant 360 buckets carried up a ladder and dumped. His shoulders burned. His hands developed calluses on top of blisters. He lost weight despite eating as much as his supplies allowed. At 3 feet down, he hit stone, not loose rocks that could be removed and tossed aside. Solid bedrock, a layer of granite that ran through the mountain foothills. Matthias drove his shovel against it, and the blade rang like a bell, barely scratching the surface. He spent half a day with the shovel, accomplishing nothing. The stone was too hard, too solid. A shovel couldn't break it. He needed a pickaxe. Wilhelm Schaefer owned a pickaxe. Matthias walked to Wilhelm's cabin and explained the problem. Wilhelm was a quiet man who asked few questions, but he looked concerned when Matthias described the project. "You're really doing this?" Wilhelm asked. "Digging under your cabin?" "Yes." "Jakob says you've gone mad with grief." "Jakob says a lot of things." Wilhelm fetched his pickaxe, a heavy tool with a wooden handle and an iron head sharpened on both ends. "You can borrow this, but Matthias, I need to ask, are you doing this because you genuinely believe it will work, or because you can't accept that your father died?" Matthias considered the question. "Both, but it will work. The physics are sound." Wilhelm handed him the pickaxe. "Then, I hope you're right." The pickaxe changed everything. Matthias swung it overhead and brought the point down on the stone layer. Chips flew. He swung again. More chips. The work was brutal, but it was progress. The stone layer was 8 inches thick. Breaking through it required 3 days of constant work. Swing the pickaxe, break loose chunks, shovel them into the bucket, carry them up, dump them. The chunks were heavy, far heavier than soil. Each bucket held fewer pieces but weighed more. His hands bled through the calluses. He wrapped them in cloth torn from an old shirt and kept working. Below the stone layer was clay, dense, wet, sticky clay that clung to the shovel and pickaxe. It was harder to remove than the topsoil, but easier than the stone. Matthias adapted his technique. He used the pickaxe to break up the clay, then shoveled it into buckets. October arrived with morning frost and shortened days. Matthias had completed the excavation by the last week of September, 8 feet down, 6 feet wide, 10 feet long. The hole represented 2 months of brutal labor, 360 cubic yards of earth removed bucket by bucket. Now came the bricks. He had made 4 trips to the trading post in September, hauling 18 bricks each time, 72 bricks stacked beside his cabin. 328 remaining. The round trips consumed his life. Wake before dawn, hitch the horse, drive east to the trading post, arrive by late afternoon, sleep in the wagon, load bricks at first light, drive home, arrive after dark, unload, sleep, repeat. Each journey took 2 full days. Matthias made 3 trips per week when weather permitted. Some weeks he managed 4 trips. Other weeks rain turned the trail to mud and he could make only 2. Jakob Brenner watched the obsessive hauling with open mockery. He made a point of riding past Matthias on the trail whenever their paths crossed. "Still collecting your fancy bricks, boy?" Jacob called out during one encounter. "How much of your father's money have you wasted now?" Matthias didn't answer. He kept the horse moving. "People are taking bets in the settlement," Jacob continued, riding alongside the wagon. "Otto thinks you'll quit before winter. Greta thinks you'll finish, but the whole thing will collapse. I think you'll finish, and then realize you've built yourself a tomb." "Maybe I have," Matthias said. Jacob laughed. "At least you're honest about it." Other settlers were less direct, but equally skeptical. Matthias would pass wagons on the trail and see people staring at his load of bricks, shaking their heads. At the trading post, Gustav stopped asking questions and simply loaded the bricks in silence, counting out Matthias's dwindling money. By late October, Matthias had made 19 trips, 342 bricks delivered, 58 remaining. The weather turned colder. Morning temperatures dropped below freezing. The trail became harder, frozen ruts that jolted the wagon. The horse struggled more with each trip. Matthias worried the animal would break down before the hauling finished. On the 21st trip, the left rear wagon wheel cracked. Matthias heard the sound a mile from home, a sharp snap followed by wobbling. He stopped immediately, examined the damage, and realized the wheel was finished. The wood had dried and split under repeated stress. He unhitched the horse, loaded 6 bricks into a saddlebag, and rode home. The wagon sat abandoned on the trail with 12 bricks still in the bed. Wilhelm helped him retrieve the wagon the next day. They repaired the wheel using spare wood and iron strapping, a full day's work. The final 2 trips happened in early November. 23 total journeys, 46 days of travel, 400 bricks delivered. Matthias stacked the final brick on November 8, 1883. The pile stood 4 feet high against the cabin's north wall. He ran his hand across the rough clay surface of the topmost brick and felt something like completion. The hauling was finished. The building could begin. The first brick went into place on November 10th. Matthias climbed down into the excavated chamber carrying a bucket of clay mortar, a trowel, and 4 bricks. An oil lamp hung from a ropes, attached to the cabin floor above, casting yellow light across the earthen walls. He had never laid bricks before. His father's sketches showed the basic principle. Apply mortar to the brick, place it level, press it into position, scrape away excess mortar. But sketches didn't convey the physical reality of the work. The first brick went down crooked. Matthias pulled it up, scraped off the mortar, tried again, still crooked. He spent an hour on that single brick before getting it level in both directions. The second brick took 30 minutes. The third took 20. By the time he placed the 10th brick, he had developed a rhythm. Apply mortar, set brick, check level, adjust, move on. The work was slow. Each brick required precision. A wall built crooked would be weak. Gaps between bricks would allow air infiltration, defeating the purpose of the chamber. Matthias worked by lamplight for hours each day. The underground space was dark, cold, and cramped. His back ached from bending. His knees hurt from kneeling on the earthen floor. Clay dust coated his clothes and skin. The mortar was a mixture of clay from the creek, sand, and water. Matthias had experimented with ratios until finding one that held firmly but remained workable. Too much water and the mortar wouldn't set. Too little, and it crumbled. The correct mixture had the consistency of thick mud. He mixed mortar in small batches, enough for an hour's work. If he mixed too much, it would begin setting before he used it. If he mixed too little, he wasted time climbing up and down the ladder to make more. By the end of November, he had completed the first 2 feet of wall height around the entire chamber perimeter, 120 bricks laid, 280 remaining. Wilhelm visited in early December. He climbed down into the chamber and examined the brickwork by lamplight. "You're doing good work," Wilhelm said, running his hand along the wall. "The joints are tight. The bricks are level. Where did you learn masonry?" "I didn't. I'm figuring it out." Wilhelm knelt and studied a corner where 2 walls met. "This is proper technique. You're keeping the pattern staggered so the joints don't line up vertically. That's important for strength. My father's sketches showed that." "Your father knew building." Wilhelm stood and looked up at the cabin floor 8 feet above. "But Matthias, this is a lot of work for a hole in the ground. Are you sure this is what you want to spend your winter doing?" "It's what I need to do." Wilhelm nodded slowly. "Then I'll help you." By mid-December, the walls stood 6 feet high. Matthias had used 320 bricks, leaving 80 for the ceiling. The chamber resembled a rectangular pit lined with smooth brick, the earthen floor still 8 feet below the cabin above. The ceiling presented a problem his father's sketches addressed but didn't fully solve. A flat ceiling would require internal support beams to hold the weight of the earth above, but support beams would obstruct the already limited space. His father had drawn an arched ceiling instead, a curved design that would support itself through compression. Matthias had never built an arch. He understood the principle from studying his father's drawings. An arch transferred weight outward to the walls rather than downward through the center. Properly constructed, it needed no internal support. But constructing it required building a temporary wooden form to hold the bricks in position until the mortar set. He spent 3 days building the form. Using planks scavenged from spare lumber, he constructed a curved framework that spanned the chamber's width. The curve was gentle, rising 2 feet from the spring point where the walls ended to the apex at the center. Wilhelm returned to help position the form. The two of them lifted it into place, propping it on temporary supports that rested on the earthen floor. The form filled much of the chamber, leaving barely enough room to work. "You'll need to work fast once you start," Wilhelm explained. "The mortar on the arch needs to set, while the form holds everything. If you remove the form too soon, the whole thing collapses." Matthias began laying bricks along the form's curve. Each brick had to be positioned precisely, angled to follow the arch, while maintaining consistent mortar joints. He worked from both sides simultaneously, building toward the center. The work was exhausting. He had to reach overhead constantly, holding each brick in place while mortar set enough to grip. His arms burned. Clay dust fell into his eyes and mouth. After 6 hours, he had completed 1/4 of the arch. After 12 hours, half. He worked through the night by lamplight, refusing to stop. If he paused and the mortar began setting unevenly, the arch might crack. Wilhelm brought food and fresh mortar, climbing down the ladder every few hours to check progress. By dawn, Matthias placed the final brick at the arch's apex, the keystone that locked everything together. He pressed it into position and held it there for 5 minutes, ensuring the mortar gripped properly. Then he climbed out and collapsed on the cabin floor. The arch had to cure for a week before he could remove the wooden form. During that time, Matthias rested. His hands were raw, his muscles exhausted. He slept 14 hours a day, his body recovering from months of constant labor. On December 23rd, he and Wilhelm climbed down and carefully removed the supporting form. The wooden framework came away cleanly. The brick arch remained in place, spanning the chamber, holding the weight of the earth above. Wilhelm tapped the arch with his knuckles. The sound was solid, confident. "It'll hold," he said. Matthias looked up at his creation. 400 bricks, 2 months of hauling, 3 months of building. The chamber was complete except for the ladder and trapdoor. The ventilation shaft required planning. An underground chamber without air circulation would suffocate its occupant. Matthias needed a way to bring fresh air in and let stale air escape. His father's sketches showed a simple solution: a vertical shaft rising from the chamber ceiling to the surface, disguised as a chimney foundation or support post. The shaft needed to be narrow enough to prevent heat loss, but wide enough for adequate airflow. Matthias chose a location in the chamber's corner, where the arch met the wall. He broke through the brick ceiling at that point, creating an opening 8 inches square. Then he began building upward. He used flat stones from the creek rather than bricks for the shaft. Stones were free, and the shaft didn't require the precision of the walls. He stacked stones in a square column, mortaring them together with his clay mixture, building upward through the 8 feet of earth between the chamber ceiling and the cabin floor. The work was awkward. He had to reach up into the shaft, placing stones blind, feeling with his hands to ensure they sat level. Progress was slow, perhaps 6 inches per day. After 2 weeks, the shaft emerged inside the cabin. Matthias continued building upward, creating a stone column that rose 2 feet above the floor. He disguised it as a support post, positioning it near the fireplace where it looked structural rather than decorative. The shaft provided ventilation, but needed protection from rain and snow. Matthias capped it with a flat stone that had a 1/2-inch gap around the edges, allowing air to pass while keeping precipitation out. Next came the trapdoor. Matthias selected thick pine planks, each 3 inches wide and 2 inches thick. He cut them to create a door 4 feet square, large enough for a person to pass through comfortably. The planks were joined using tongue and groove joinery, each plank interlocking with its neighbor. The result was a solid panel that moved as a single piece. He reinforced the underside with cross braces, thick boards, mounted diagonally to prevent warping. The hinges were simple iron pieces purchased from Gustav at the trading post, the last of Matthias's money. He mortised them into both the trapdoor and the cabin floor, creating a connection that was flush and strong. The trapdoor was heavy, nearly 70 pounds of solid wood. Matthias tested it repeatedly, opening and closing, ensuring the hinges held and the door sat flush when closed. The latter was the final element. Matthias built it from pine, cutting notches into 2 long poles for steps. The steps were spaced 12 inches apart, comfortable for climbing. He positioned the ladder at an angle rather than vertical, making descent easier. On January 15, 1884, Matthias completed the final work. He stood in his cabin and looked down at the open trapdoor. Below, lamplight illuminated brick walls, an arched ceiling, a ladder descending into engineered safety. He had built what his father had only sketched: an underground chamber that would maintain stable temperature regardless of surface conditions, a refuge from cold that could kill. Now he needed to test it. The cold snap arrived on February 3, 1884. Matthias woke to a cabin temperature of 18 degrees, despite the fire burning steadily all night. Outside, the thermometer read 31 degrees below zero. He had been waiting for this. Montana winters always brought extreme cold. The question was whether his chamber would perform as calculated. By mid-morning, the cabin temperature had dropped to 12 degrees. Matthias kept the fire built up, feeding it constantly. But the cold penetrated the walls faster than heat could replace it. The pattern was familiar, the same progression that had killed his father 2 years earlier. He descended into the chamber at noon. The transition was immediate. The ladder took him down through increasingly warmer air. By the time his feet touched the brick floor 8 feet below, the temperature felt noticeably different. He had brought his father's thermometer. The reading showed 53 degrees. Matthias sat on the brick floor, his back against the wall. The chamber felt enclosed, utterly different from the exposed cabin above. He stayed for an hour, monitoring the temperature. 53 degrees. His body heat began raising it slightly. After 2 hours, 55 degrees. After 3 hours, 57 degrees. The chamber worked exactly as the physics predicted. The Earth's stable temperature dominated. The brick walls held that temperature. His body heat added warmth to the enclosed space. He climbed back up at mid-afternoon. The cabin was now 8 degrees. Matthias made a decision. He gathered blankets, food, water, and his father's Bible. He extinguished the cabin fire, conserving wood. Then he descended into the chamber and closed the trapdoor above him. The darkness was complete with the trapdoor closed. Only his oil lamp provided light. He spread blankets on the brick floor and lay down. The temperature held at 57 degrees. With his body wrapped in wool blankets, the cold was manageable. Matthias spent 3 days in the chamber. He emerged only to check the cabin temperature and retrieve supplies. Each time he opened the trapdoor, brutal cold rushed down. Each time he closed it, the chamber's warmth stabilized. On the 3rd day, the cold snap broke. The outside temperature rose to 15 degrees, warm enough that the cabin fireplace could maintain livable conditions. Matthias climbed out of the chamber on February 6th. He was healthy, well-rested, and vindicated. The chamber had protected him completely during cold that would have been dangerous in the cabin alone. Jakob Brenner arrived that afternoon. He had seen smoke from Matthias's chimney resume and came to investigate. "Heard the cold got bad," Jakob said. "Surprised you survived it." "I didn't survive it in the cabin," Matthias replied. "I survived it underground." Jacob's expression shifted from concern to disgust. "You hid in your hole?" "I used the chamber I built. It stayed at 57 degrees while the cabin dropped below 10. "That's cowardice. Real men face the cold. Real men also die from it." Jacob shook his head. "You're proving everyone right. You've let fear make you weak." Spring and summer passed quietly. Matthias worked his father's trap lines, maintained the cabin, and lived alone. The settlement's opinion of him had hardened into a narrative. The boy who lost his father had become obsessed, building an elaborate refuge from irrational fear. But Matthias paid attention to signs others ignored. In September, the birds began migrating south 3 weeks earlier than usual. Geese that normally stayed until late October departed in early September. Smaller birds disappeared even earlier. Matthias watched the empty skies and felt uneasy. In October, the squirrels worked with unusual intensity. They gathered acorns and pine nuts frantically, storing far more than typical years. Matthias observed them while checking his trap lines. Animals prepared for winter instinctively, responding to environmental cues humans often missed. In early November, the first snow arrived 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The storm was brief but heavy, dropping 8 inches overnight. The snow melted within days, but its early arrival concerned Matthias. He began preparations. He cut extra firewood, stacking cords around the cabin. He checked and rechecked his underground chamber, ensuring everything remained solid. He purchased additional supplies from Gustav at the trading post: dried beans, flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil. "Stocking up heavy this year," Gustav observed while loading supplies into Matthias's wagon. "I think it's going to be a hard winter," Matthias said. "Every winter's hard. That's Montana. This one feels different." Gustav shrugged. "You've thought every winter was dangerous since your father died. Maybe you're just seeing patterns that aren't there." Matthias didn't argue. He took his supplies home and continued preparing. In late November, he visited Jacob Brenner. Jacob was repairing his cabin's chinking routine maintenance before winter settled in fully. "Jacob," Matthias said, "I think this winter is going to be severe, worse than normal. The signs are all there." Jacob glanced at him and laughed. "The boy prophet comes with warnings." "What signs? Your underground hole telling you secrets?" "The birds migrated early. The animals are gathering more food than usual. The first snow came weeks ahead of schedule." "That's just nature being unpredictable. Doesn't mean anything. It means animals sense something coming. They're preparing for extreme conditions." Jacob set down his trowel and faced Matthias directly. "Listen, boy, I've survived 15 Montana winters. I know how to read weather. Some years are colder, some are milder. But they're all survivable if you're tough. Enough. Your problem is you're not tough. You're scared. You see danger everywhere because you're looking for excuses to hide in your hole." "I'm trying to help," Matthias said. "Then help by being less of a coward. Show people that Friedrich Keller's son can face winter like a man instead of burrowing into the earth like a frightened animal." Matthias tried speaking with other neighbors. Wilhelm listened, but seemed uncertain. Greta Brenner was polite but dismissive. Otto Zimmer openly mocked the idea. "The boy's predicting doom again," Otto announced at the trading post when Matthias mentioned his concerns. "Every year, it's the same. This winter will be terrible, and every year winter comes and goes like always." By December, Matthias stopped warning people. They wouldn't listen. They had decided he was controlled by fear, and nothing he said would change their minds. The storm began on December 18th with light snow and moderate wind. Nothing unusual. Montana winters included dozens of such storms. Jacob Brenner watched it start and felt satisfied. Another normal winter, proof the boy had been wrong again. By evening, the wind had increased. Snow fell heavier, driven horizontal by gusts that rattled cabin walls. Jacob added wood to his fireplace and settled in for a typical winter storm. By midnight, the wind was screaming. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to 0. The temperature plummeted. Jacob's thermometer showed 22 degrees below 0 and falling. He woke his wife Greta and their 2 children. "Keep the fire built up," he instructed. "This one's strong." Day 2 brought worse conditions. The wind exceeded anything Jacob had experienced. Gusts hit the cabin like physical blows. Snow accumulated against the north wall, drifting to the roofline. The temperature outside read 36 degrees below 0. Inside, despite the fire burning constantly, the cabin temperature dropped to 28 degrees. Jacob burned wood faster than he had anticipated. His supply was adequate for a normal winter, but this storm was consuming fuel at triple the usual rate. Day 3. Wind unabated, snow still falling. Temperature outside 41 degrees below 0. Inside Jacob's cabin, 19 degrees. His children were wrapped in every blanket the family owned, huddled near the fireplace. Greta's hands showed early signs of frostbite despite being indoors. Jacob himself felt the deep cold penetrating his core, the kind of cold that killed regardless of shelter. He checked his firewood supply. At the current consumption rate, he had perhaps 2 more days of fuel. After that, the fire would die, and the cabin would become a tomb. Other families faced identical crises. Otto Zimmer's cabin dropped to 15 degrees. Wilhelm Schaefer's reached 12 degrees. Every cabin in the settlement struggled against cold that overwhelmed their heating capacity. Day 4. The storm showed no signs of weakening. Jacob Brenner made a decision that broke something inside him. He gathered his wife and children, wrapped them in blankets, and led them through waist-deep snow toward Matthias Keller's cabin. The journey took 30 minutes to cover half a mile. The wind threatened to knock them down. Snow blinded them. Jacob's face went numb. His youngest daughter cried from the cold, her tears freezing to her cheeks. They reached Matthias's door. Jacob pounded on it with numb fists. Matthias opened the door. He looked at the family standing in the blizzard, saw Jacob's expression, pride destroyed, desperation winning, and simply nodded. "Come in," Matthias said. He led them to the trapdoor and opened it. Warm air rose from below, a physical presence against their frozen skin. "Climb down," Matthias instructed. "There's room for everyone." Jakob descended the ladder first, then helped his children down. Greta followed. Matthias came last, closing the trapdoor behind them. The Brenner family stood in the brick chamber, staring at walls that held back the killing cold. The temperature was 61 degrees. Jakob said nothing. There was nothing to say. The Brenner family sat against the brick wall, slowly warming. Jakob's children stopped shivering within 20 minutes. Greta's hands regained feeling, painful, but recovering. Jakob himself remained silent, staring at the floor. Matthias gave them blankets and water. He had prepared for his own survival, not for hosting guests, but he shared what he had. "How long can we stay?" Jakob finally asked. "As long as necessary," Matthias replied. "Your supplies won't last with 5 people. We'll make them last." Above them, the storm continued its assault. Wind hammered the cabin, snow accumulated. The cold deepened. Inside the chamber, the temperature held steady at 61 degrees, warmed by 5 bodies in an enclosed space designed for 1. On the morning of day 5, someone knocked on the cabin door above. Matthias climbed the ladder and opened the trap door. Cold air rushed down. He crossed the frozen cabin and opened the door. Wilhelm Schaefer stood there with his wife Elsa. Both were wrapped in blankets, frost coating their faces. "My cabin is 12 degrees, Wilhelm said. "The fire can't keep up. Can we—" "Come in," Matthias said. He led them to the trap door. Wilhelm looked down at the chamber, saw the Brenner family below, and understood immediately. He climbed down. Elsa followed. 7 people now occupied a space designed for 1. The chamber felt crowded but manageable. Body heat raised the temperature to 64 degrees. By evening of day 5, Otto Zimmer arrived with his teenage son. Then the Vogel family, husband, wife, 3 children. By day 6, 13 people sheltered in Matthias's underground chamber. The space was cramped. People sat shoulder to shoulder against the walls. Movement required coordination. Privacy was impossible, but everyone was warm. Everyone was alive. Jakob organized rationing. Matthias had stored food for himself through winter, but 13 people consumed supplies rapidly. They calculated carefully. Dried beans, flour, water, lamp oil. If the storm lasted another week, they would run dangerously low. The children adapted quickly. They played quiet games, whispered stories, slept in shifts. The adults remained mostly silent, processing the reality of their situation. Otto Zimmer spoke what others were thinking on day 7. Every cabin in this settlement was built the same way. Notched logs, mud chinking, single fireplace. We all followed the same pattern because that's how it's always been done. "It works most winters," Wilhelm said, "but not this winter. This winter, traditional construction failed, every single cabin." Jakob looked at Matthias. The boy sat in the corner, managing lamp oil, checking supplies, maintaining the refuge he had built. The boy everyone had mocked. The boy Jakob had called a coward. "You tried to warn us," Jakob said quietly. Matthias met his eyes. "Yes. We didn't listen." "No, you didn't. If you hadn't built this, my family would be dead right now." Matthias nodded. "Probably, yes." The chamber fell silent except for the sound of 13 people breathing in a space that kept them alive while the world above tried to kill them. Day 8 brought a subtle shift. The wind's screaming intensity diminished slightly. The snow continued but seemed less violent. Matthias climbed the ladder and opened the trapdoor briefly to check conditions. The cabin was a frozen shell. Ice coated the interior walls where moisture had condensed and frozen. The fireplace held snow that had blown down the chimney. The temperature inside the cabin matched the temperature outside, 43 degrees below zero. He closed the trapdoor and descended. "Storm's still bad," he reported. "No change in conditions." The community settled into routines. They rationed food strictly, eating twice daily. Water was collected by melting snow that Matthias retrieved during brief trips to the surface. Lamp oil was used sparingly, keeping only one lamp burning at a time. Greta Brenner organized the children's activities, keeping them quiet and occupied. Wilhelm led simple prayers each evening. Otto calculated supplies obsessively, rechecking numbers, adjusting rations. Jakob spent most of his time silent. He watched Matthias move through the chamber, managing details, solving small problems, maintaining the systems that kept everyone alive. The boy worked with quiet competence, never mentioning that he had warned them, never pointing out that he had been right. On day 9, Jakob finally spoke to him directly. "Why did you let us in?" Matthias looked up from organizing blankets. "What? We mocked you. I mocked you specifically, called you a coward, told everyone you were wasting your time and money. Why did you open your door when I came asking for help?" Matthias considered the question. "Because you needed help." "That's it? No revenge? No satisfaction in proving us wrong? What good would that do? Your children would still be freezing." Jacob nodded slowly. "You're a better man than I am. I'm just a person who solved a problem. You would have done the same if you'd seen the solution. I didn't see it. That's the difference." The days blurred together. Day 10, day 11, the storm continued with relentless consistency. The chamber's brick walls held the earth's warmth. The arched ceiling supported the weight above. The ventilation shaft provided fresh air. Every element Matthias had engineered performed exactly as designed. On day 12, someone asked about the bricks. Why bricks? Why not just earth walls? Matthias explained thermal mass, how bricks absorbed and radiated heat more effectively than bare earth. How uniform surfaces sealed better than irregular ones. How permanent construction meant the chamber would serve for decades. People listened with attention they had never given him before. They were sitting inside the proof of his engineering. Every principle he had learned, every calculation he had made, every brick he had hauled, all of it validated by simple survival. Wilhelm asked about the arch. Matthias explained compression, keystones, how curved structures supported weight without internal beams. Children watched him sketch diagrams on the brick floor using charcoal. The underground refuge became a classroom. Knowledge transferred not through authority, but through demonstrated success. Day 13 began like the previous 12. Storm above, warmth below. But subtle changes appeared in the chamber's atmosphere. 13 people breathing in an enclosed space for nearly 2 weeks created challenges Matthias hadn't anticipated. The air quality diminished despite the ventilation shaft. The smell of unwashed bodies became oppressive. Tempers shortened. Small disagreements erupted over blanket space, lamp positioning, food distribution. Matthias increased ventilation by opening the trapdoor briefly each hour, allowing fresh air to cycle through despite the cold it brought. The temperature would drop to 58 degrees during these exchanges, then recover to 64 within minutes. Children grew restless. The novelty of underground living had faded. They wanted to run, to see daylight, to escape confinement. Greta worked constantly to keep them calm, but her own patience was wearing thin. Otto and Jakob argued on day 14 about food rationing. Otto wanted to reduce portions further to extend supplies. Jakob insisted they were already eating minimally. The argument escalated until Wilhelm intervened, suggesting they wait one more day before deciding. That evening, during a ventilation cycle with the trapdoor open, everyone fell silent. They listened to the wind above. Something had changed. The howling had diminished. The fury was lessening. "Storm's breaking," Wilhelm said quietly. Day 15 confirmed it. Matthias climbed into the cabin and found conditions improved. Wind still blew, but without the previous violence. Snow fell lightly, rather than in blinding sheets. Temperature outside 28 degrees below zero. Still dangerous, but survivable with proper precautions. "We can return to our cabin soon," Matthias told the group. "Maybe tomorrow, if conditions continue improving." The relief was visible. People had survived, but survival in cramped quarters for 2 weeks had extracted its own cost. They were ready for space, privacy, normalcy. Day 16 brought calm. The storm had passed. Temperature rose to 18 degrees below zero. Matthias opened the trapdoor fully. Winter sunlight streamed down, the first natural light people had seen in over 2 weeks. Families climbed out slowly, blinking in the brightness. They emerged into a transformed world. Snow had drifted to heights that buried fences and reached cabin roof lines. The landscape was sculpted into alien shapes by wind and accumulation. Jakob's cabin was intact but frozen solid inside. Wilhelm's showed damage to the roof where snow weight had stressed the structure. Otto's door had been torn from its hinges by wind. They returned to the chamber briefly to gather their belongings. As each family prepared to leave, they thanked Matthias, some with words, others with gestures, all with expressions that acknowledged a debt beyond repayment. Jacob was last. He stood at the trapdoor looking down at the brick chamber that had saved his family. "I was wrong about you," he said simply. "Yes," Matthias replied. "You were." Jacob nodded and left. Matthias closed the trapdoor and sat alone in his cabin. Outside, the settlement began digging out from the storm. Inside, a 17-year-old boy who had been right when everyone else was wrong simply rested. Spring came slowly to Montana Territory in 1885. Snow persisted through March. Full thaw didn't arrive until late April. When it did, the settlement discovered the storm's full toll. 3 families had not sheltered in Matthias's chamber. The Hoffman family had lived 2 miles distant. The Schultz family had decided to tough it out in their cabin. A lone trapper named Hayes had been caught in his remote cabin. All had perished, frozen in their cabins, their fires exhausted, their bodies discovered when neighbors finally reached them in early January. The settlement buried 9 people that spring. By summer, 7 families were digging sleeping cellars beneath their cabins. Jacob Brenner started first. He excavated methodically, following the principles Matthias had demonstrated. 8 feet deep, brick-lined walls, arched ceiling, ventilation shaft, reinforced trapdoor. Wilhelm helped others with their construction. Otto purchased bricks and began hauling. The Vogel family dug together, parents and children working in shifts. Matthias helped each family. He explained thermal mass principles, showed proper bricklaying. Technique demonstrated arch construction. The knowledge he had gained through obsessive study became community property. By winter of 1885, 12 families had completed sleeping cellars. The settlement had transformed into a community that understood underground survival. The technique spread beyond the immediate settlement. Trappers traveling through heard about the chamber that had saved 13 lives. They carried the story to other regions. Trading post conversations included discussions of earth temperature and thermal mass. The innovation acquired a name, the Cellar method. Matthias turned 18 in June. The settlement's attitude toward him had shifted completely. No one called him a coward. He had become the person you consulted about survival engineering. Jacob Brenner completed his sleeping cellar in August. He invited Matthias to inspect it. The two descended into a chamber nearly identical to Matthias's original. "It's good work," Matthias said. "I learned from the best," Jacob replied. Then, after a pause, "I'm sorry for how I treated you. You believed what you believed. But you were right. That matters." Matthias nodded. "That people are building these now." Winter of 1886 brought another severe storm. This time, families descended into their chambers without panic. They knew the cellars worked. They had been taught by someone who understood that survival was engineering, not toughness. Matthias Keller lived in Montana Territory until 1893, when he moved to Oregon. He married, had children, lived quietly. But in the mountains he left behind, brick-lined chambers beneath cabin floors continued protecting people from cold that killed. The legacy wasn't in monuments or written records, it was built into the earth itself. Carved and bricked and engineered by a teenage boy who refused to accept that his father's death was simply bad luck. When extreme cold came, people descended into safety, sheltered by knowledge that had spread from one obsessive project into frontier doctrine. The boy they had mocked had saved not just 13 lives in one storm, but dozens more across the following decades. His father's sketches, combined with a son's determination, had changed how people survived the Montana wilderness. Not through toughness or luck, but through understanding that sometimes the answer to surface danger lay beneath the earth, where temperature held steady and brick walls kept the killing cold at bay.